Why do you say that, Father? You aren't afraid, are you?
No, but I respect some of the superstitions of others. Often they are founded in fact.
Broadcasting live from our Sanctum Sanctorum in bountiful Bakersfield, California. This is the Sixth Sense Society. I'm your host, Krista, here with our producer, Michael, and today we're really excited to have Paul Weston from Glastonbury on the show today. He is the author of 11 books, lecturer, and a tour guide, and basically he draws his transformational ideas from both Western and Eastern paths. But today we ask him on the show to talk about someone very special to many people in the esoteric world, and that is Dion Fortune, who he has a lot of depth and understanding of. But before we get started, Michael has a few announcements.
Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the show. We got some great stuff coming up next week. We have Jackie Smith coming on to talk about the Witches Union and why she thinks it's important for witches to unionize. And then we end the month with Caroline Marshall and Marnie Olson, our astrologer friends, looking at the upcoming elections in the U.S. and what lies ahead for the second half of the year. So great stuff. Get all the information on our website, sixthsensesociety.com, SAXTH, all spelled out. And while you're there, if you can afford to, buy us a coffee on Ko-Fi. Helps us cover a bit of our production cost. But the most important thing, go to click like and subscribe on YouTube. Help us grow our show and tell your friends about us, and that really matters the most to us. Don't want to take up too much time today because there's so much to cover with Dion Fortune, and I'm so excited to hear our guests. So I'm going to kick it back to you guys. So take it away, Krista.
Great. Thank you, Michael, and welcome to the show, Paul.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, I am particularly excited. I've always wanted to have someone come on and talk about Dion Fortune, who is just one of my favorite people, really, in the Western esoteric tradition, even though I mostly have just read her works. So I thought maybe it would be good to start off with talking a little bit about who she is, a little background, so for people that don't know anything about her.
Okay, so first of all, the timescale. Her life is from 1891 to 1946. People probably think of her as the leading female occultist of the 20th century. They would put her, maybe second only to Aleister Crowley as the most influential occultist of the 20th century. She's a mystic, she's an occultist, she's a novelist, and it's her novels that in certain respects are perhaps most widely known and read because they bring occult themes into the modern world and have figures playing out intense mystical magical dramas within the realms of the 20th century life that we would all recognize. She's somebody that had mediumistic abilities, memories of past lives in Atlantis, all this kind of thing, became an early psychoanalyst in London during the First World War, joined the Theosophical Society, decided that their emphasis was too much on Eastern rather than Western spirituality, and that there had been a neglect of our myths and traditions that we would do well to rectify. She was initiated into what we'll call the Golden Dawn tradition, which basically is formatted on the study of the Kabbalistic tree of life as expressed by Western occultists. That's a contentious enough point to begin with. So you're learning a whole bunch of associations. You're learning the tarot, you're learning all kinds of things. And in the course of this, she forms her own order, the Society of the Inner Light. As the 1920s go into the 1930s, she produces a series of works. Psychic Self-Defense is a classic of its kind. The Mystical Qabalah. She had a base in London and also a base in Glastonbury, and she wrote a lovely little book about Glastonbury in the mid-30s called Avalon of the Heart, which I'll be making a lot of reference to as we go along. Her novels, particularly The Sea Priestess and Moon Magic, portrayed the character of the priestess in the modern world. I'll come back to that theme. But in terms of my work and what I've written, it's her role in what you might call the inner plane aspect of the Second World War, what's been called the magical Battle of Britain, what I've written up as the occult Battle of Britain, which has probably given me my most long-term connection with her. I'll explain all that as we go along. It also should be said that if you get some of her books, I think quite a lot of them now have a kind of note at the beginning saying, please be aware that Dion Fortune's opinions are in certain respects representative of an older age and are not always entirely appropriate now. You know, there are some people who are not too keen on her because of here and there her attitudes towards sexuality and race and so on. I do not for 1 minute believe, you know, that she is, as it were, a racist in the way that we understand it in the modern terms.
Right.
And although she makes statements, as do other mystics like Blavatsky, like Steiner, concerning the karma of different races and so forth, which is now very problematic. The bottom line is, at the end of the day, she resisted Hitler mightily. She was entirely opposed to Nazism. She made a pretty big policy statement of where she really stood during the Second World War, and it's generally considered that her efforts in that department wore her out, and she died prematurely through the intensity of what she experienced then.
I wondered about that because she was young when she died.
Yeah.
She was young when she died. Like
she
50s.
was, I think she was about 56. She had got leukemia, I think it was. Very rapid onset.
Yeah, and the fact that she stayed.
That was in 1946, so it's pretty much just as the Second World War as played out. You know, in my book, I do point to some interesting things that happened in the same week that she died, but I'll leave that as just a teaser rather than something that I can go into now.
Now, her name is interesting too. How she chose her name. When she was born Violet Mary Firth, and she took on a different name. And do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, it's a standard thing in those magical orders, the Golden Dawn, that at different points in the proceedings, you take on mottos that are magical names. So it's God, not luck, basically. That's what it sort of the Latin extends into, but she makes it into this kind of pen name, which has worked pretty well. Obviously, that's what we know her as. Absolutely.
I don't think I even knew that she had a different name until I came across the magical motto idea.
You will occasionally come across editions of some of her books. I've seen a first edition of Avalon of the Heart, which is Violet Firth.
Huh. Yeah. No, that's pretty extraordinary.
Dion Fortune is what she expresses to the world.
So, I mean, I think it's there's many things we could talk about with her. I like the idea of talking about the whole the Battle of Britain because of the times we're in, and also the show we just did with Gary Lockman about politics and the occult. And it seems to be a very important topic, and that there is magic being used, whether you believe in it or not, doesn't really matter. I mean, you know, it's just the way things are. So it seems very relevant to talk about that aspect of her.
Well, I'll unfold the story of my gradually deepening connection with this material, you know, how that happened over a period of decades. Way back in the early 80s, I had come across examples of what's now pretty much an entire genre, Nazi occultism. There were just a few books about then, Spear of Destiny, Morning of the Magicians. They were very evocative. They carried a certain mood, but when it came to the factuality of their material, they were very, very dubious. But nonetheless, I was compelled, and I studied the subject wherever I could. And I ended up doing a degree where I majored in comparative religion, and I was pretty fortunate to be able to actually get them to agree to me doing a dissertation on Nazi occultism towards my degree. That was back in 1983, so that was quite early on in the proceedings. Now, in 1988, I read Alan Richardson's biography of Dion Fortune, Priestess, and it was then that I first discovered what had happened in 1939-40, which is broadly, I'll go into more detail as we go along, but basically Dion Fortune broke with the traditions of hierarchy and initiation due to what she considered to be the urgency of the situation, and sent out letters to people on her mailing list, giving them details of weekly visualization meditations that they were going to do. They began in late 1939 and carried on all the way through 1940. People would all get together around the country and tune in. I think it was 11:15 on a Sunday morning, close their eyes and visualize stuff. And what they then would write in a letter and send back to Dion Fortune in London would contain maybe little snippets of what they'd seen, and what they saw was then fed into what they did the next week. And basically what happened was, over a period of months, they built up an enormous internal landscape inside the huge, great hill of Glastonbury Tor, an area which very much dominates the landscape around here and is kind of like our equivalent of Devil's Tower, Wyoming, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, in terms of its charisma and the extent to which it draws people towards it. Inside the Tor, visualized as being entirely hollow, was a red rose on a cross of gold hanging in the air. Above it was Jesus Christ. Beneath it was the Virgin Mary, and on either side of it was King Arthur sitting on a white horse holding up Excalibur, and on the other side Merlin sitting on a throne holding an orb of sovereignty. This imagery took a while to develop, and it was intended to evoke our entire national mythology as a spiritual defense against Nazism, which was obviously using magical archetypal imagery and was, packing a lot of voltage. Now, what I found fascinating, because I'd already been looking into the Nazis, what isn't mentioned in Priestess, and what was not actually known even to British intelligence during the course of the war, was that the Nazis had this Grail castle at Wavelsburg that Heinrich Himmler had lavished resources on creating, and at the time I was aware there was an espionage novel about it by a guy called Duncan Card. It was called Black Camelot. And I thought that was a great title to describe Wavelsburg. And I got this sense of, it was very interesting that Glastonbury, with all its associations of King Arthur and the Grail romances, was on the opposite side of Wavelsburg, and Dion Fortune was involved in this kind of spiritual tussle. And yet there's no indication that she even knew the place existed. So that was fascinating to me.
Wow, that's amazing. I never heard that.
What I also took from Priestess was the idea that she worked in general, not just in 1940, but in a lot of her work, with the idea of the archetypes of the collective unconscious in relation to countries that affect deeper levels of the mythic consciousness by doing precisely what we've just been talking about. And as part of her work at that point, I've mentioned the novels Sea Priestess and Moon Magic. She had powered up the archetype of the priestess when it comes to how would such a figure conduct themselves in the modern world. There weren't really any role models. There were the male magus types. You've got your Crowleys and your Samuel Little McGregor Mavers and Leifus Levi and all these people going back, Cagliostro, John Dee, blah, blah, blah. But when it comes to the women, because of the whole business with the witches, the burning times and so on, what we've got in the Arthurian romances, Morgana Le Fay, she's got a negative, portrayal. But in these novels, Dion Fortune created these characters, Vivian Le Fay Morgan and Lilith Le Fay Morgan, who are essentially the archetype of Morgan Le Fay, rehabilitated, re-empowered. And I personally consider that if you're talking about the inner plane, Dion Fortune and this rehabilitation of the priestess was an important part of the emergence of the pagan revival, Wicca, the goddess movement, everything. She's kind of there or thereabouts. But that's, that was my introduction to what had happened in 1940 and me getting deeper into Dion Fortune. So I read her book, The Mystical Qabalah, and I started doing, the kind of basic magical work that those orders train you up in, the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagram, where you're drawing pentagrams at the 4 quarters and you're calling up 4 archangels and visualizing them and so on and so forth. I did all that kind of stuff every day for a pretty long time, a few years really. And that was kind of like my ABCs in this. But then in 1990, I was involved in something called psychic questing, which had been initiated by the author Andrew Collins, who's now a mainstay on Ancient Aliens, has written books about the Denisovans and the Göbekli Tepe, all this kind of stuff. He was very much involved in using standard psychism, if you like, visualization, medium psychics, going out into the landscape, engaging in historical mysteries. There's a lot. We had some great adventures. And as part of all of that, some of the people that were in that group, we kind of had a little side act where we used to go out on the full moon. And it started off with us just finding ourselves in the middle of a field on a full moon, and we sat down in a circle and visualized all this light, this big cone coming down from the moon. And we thought, oh, that was great. What are we going to do next full moon? And before we knew where we were all sort of dressing up in robes and swords and incense and doing the whole thing. And in Dion Fortune's novel, The Sea Priestess, there is fragments of a ritual that's done by the sea, where a fire of particular woods is kindled, and it's called the Fire of Azrael, who's the archangel of the angel of death, I should say, and you divine the future. And the Wiccan writers, Janet and Stuart Farrer, had created in their book, A Witch's Bible, a seashore ritual which had put together the fragments that you find in Dion Fortune's novel into a workable ceremony. And this group of people that I was doing this full moon stuff with, particularly a friend of mine called Alex Langstone, who's a writer and a poet. He wrote a fantastic book about a psychic quest involving St. Bega called Spirit Chasing. We really wanted to do this ritual ourselves, the Sea Priestess ritual, and he found this place right on the edge of the county of Essex, in the middle of nowhere, where 2 rivers kind of went into the sea at the same point. A bunch of us went out, and we all met at a crossroads at midnight. We went out into the middle of nowhere, and we did this whole thing that was our version. It was close enough to what the Pharaohs had taken from Dion Fortune, but we were visualizing a form of Isis from the Golden Ash of Apuleius, which is like a classic version of Isis in the Roman world. All the goddesses of the classical world rolled into one. We were doing all this kind of stuff. We did the fire. The water put it out. The tide came in and put the fire out at exactly the right moment. As we invoked Isis, the clouds parted, the full moon shone. I got back at about 1 o'clock in the morning, and all I wanted to do was just take my shoes and my coat off and just fall on my bed and not even clean my teeth. But I decided to have a cup of hot chocolate, and that changed the time that I would have been lying on my bed. Because while I was cleaning my teeth, the whole house shook with this enormous great crash. And when I tried to investigate what had happened, I couldn't even open my bedroom door. And as I managed to finally squeeze in there, it was like a third of my ceiling had collapsed.
Wow.
Most of it over my bed. It was surprising, considering there was a loft there, how big some of these bits of masonry and ceiling stuff were. I would have been seriously injured if I'd been lying on this bed. So this made me realise this ritual and its performance were extremely potent and powerful. Now, I tell the full story of this in my book, Archetypes.
Mm-hmm.
A few years later, this leads into a profound past life saga. Alex was involved in this, and we eventually found our way to Bream Down, which is in Somerset, about an hour away from Glastonbury, and is the place that was the physical location for the original Sea Priestess novel. A whole bunch of stuff goes on there, but that's too complicated for me to go into. There's a lot of stuff in my Archetypes about that.
So did that like, can I ask you something? Did that startle you in terms of like, scare you off a little when the ceiling collapsed like that?
By that time, I was a long way away from consensus reality. I was already a long way down the river to Cambodia by then. There was no turning back. There was no off switch. It was just, okay, you know, I was not married. I lived alone, didn't have any kids. It was like, if I'd have been in a situation where I thought maybe, you know, this kind of thing is potentially going to endanger other people I'm around, but I was with a bunch of psychonauts who were just, you know, ever further onwards. There was no stopping us, and that was just part of where it got to.
Wow.
So in 1993, Gareth Knight, who's very much a writer in the Dion Fortune tradition, if you like, he published a collection of her letters from 1940 as The Magical Battle of Britain. And I obviously read them immediately and started to see how this stuff had unfolded, because it took months for this imagery to develop into its fullest form. Now, Knight in that book makes the briefest references to what's going on in the war
right
at the time of these letters. Now, as a history freak, as a person of an age who has grown up seeing movies like The Battle of Britain on the TV here in the UK, you know, however many times Dunkirk, the original Dunkirk movie from the 1950s, I know that stuff. And I started to run my own comparisons in my head. And this became very important in how this later developed. In 1995, I was still living in Essex, and it was the 50th anniversary of the end of the war in Europe, VE Day. And I knew that day there was going to be beacon fires lit all around the country. There was going to be one on Glastonbury Tor. There was going to be 2 minutes silence before these beacon fires were lit in the evening. Now, that day, I was watching some of the stuff in London on TV, stuff at Buckingham Palace. It didn't really do anything for me. I'd pulled a tarot card that morning as a key to the day, and it was the lightning struck tower. And I thought, wow, yeah, what's gonna happen here? Now, at that time, I had a copy of Dion Fortune's book about Glastonbury from the local library, Avalon of the Heart, and it was a version that had a picture of Glastonbury Tor on the cover. I turned the TV off and I thought, what am I supposed to do today? And, you know, I'll always remember this. This is no word of a lie. It wasn't that sunny that morning, and suddenly the clouds parted and a shaft of sunlight came right through my window and hit the cover of that book on the floor, illuminating Glastonbury Tor. And I knew in a nanosecond what I was going to do. During that 2 minute silence later that night, I would phone around, because this is pre-internet, and I would see if I could get people to join me in recreating the 1940 visualization of being inside Glastonbury Tor. And I managed to get, I don't know, half a dozen people together, and that's what we did. And it was tremendously emotional. Now, the moment I came out of that 2 minutes, I switched the TV on. And what I saw was the Queen was in Hyde Park, and she was standing in front of this high-tech console, and she pressed a button, and a laser beam went from there to a landmark building in London called the GPO Tower, which is like a tall conical building. And all these lights shot up in a spiral fashion all up the top of this building and a load of fireworks shot out the top of it. And I thought, well, if that's not a lightning struck tower, I don't know what is. And I got feedback from my friends who had been involved in all of this. And there was a woman I used to go to university with, former girlfriend of mine, very visionary, read The Mist of Avalon however many times, was used to the idea of going into visionary realms inside Glastonbury Tour. Now, what she said was she went into Glastonbury Tour and saw Arthur Pendragon stark naked, sporting a magnificent erection. And she went over to him and touched that. And at that moment, there was like lightning bolts shooting out across the landscape. It was like the whole country was lit up. And I thought, wow, you know, this is not the Victorian stead, King Arthur of Alfred Lord Tennyson. This is the Pendragon.
Yeah.
This stuff is incredibly alive. And we have this equilibration really strong. One hand, Jesus and Mary, on the other hand, Arthur and Merlin, this equilibration of Glastonbury's pagan and Christian mythos in harmony. And within a month of that, I had managed to secure a move to Glastonbury. And within another year, I was working in a factory and I started pondering this imagery from 1940, which is based on the Qabalah, you know, middle pillar. It's like Christ is in Kethar. This rose cross is Tifereth, and the Virgin Mary is Yesod, Arthur is Beour, Merlin is Hesed. There were missing parts there. And I'd read the mystical Qabalah. I found myself readily just formulating missing imagery based on stuff in the mystical Qabalah. So one example I'll give, for Hokmah, I saw Joseph Arimathea in profile, holding his famous staff on Wiriel Hill, which is where he's supposed to have landed, and planted this staff, which flowered into a thorn. And there's this mist all around him. And in the sky above him is the signs of the zodiac, particularly the alleged landscape zodiac that we've got here in Glastonbury. So this was a very distinct Glastonbury visual, but it was all formulated on imagery appropriate to that spirit of Qabalah that's specifically mentioned in mystical Qabalah. And I ended up doing public events. I did one on Dion Fortune's birthday, the 6th of December 1996, where I did a path working where basically it's a bunch of people just sitting around with their eyes closed, going through my enhanced visuals. And it was fascinating because, for example, my girlfriend at the time, a woman called Chandira, she said, oh, I saw this real weird thing. I saw a Spitfire, the famous World War II fighter plane, and Merlin was flying in. And she had no idea that the engine of the Spitfire was called a Merlin engine. Oh. She didn't know. And it was like, I just thought, okay, this is absolutely fascinating. Oh. So I started to use this. And, you know, years later, my first book, Mysterium Artorius, the whole of that, my version, Glastonbury Qabalah, I've called it, was in there. And in 2010, it was the 70th anniversary of Battle of Britain. So there's loads of stuff in the media here. And there's a particular date, the 15th of September, which is considered to be the turning point in that. And that's always commemorated as Battle of Britain Day here. And I, again, put this public event on. And it was so potent that I thought, I think I could get a book out of this, you know. And at that point, I started to formulate 1940 and realised that what I could do is go through the way that imagery developed through these letters with far more detail about what was going on in the war. I thought, is there anything to commend that? And I immediately discovered that, in fact, there was something absolutely fascinating because of my history nerd knowledge of 1940 and the kind of stuff that I've read. You see, at the end of the Polish campaign, right at the end of September 1939, the German army are pretty much thinking of putting all their equipment into storage. It doesn't even occur to them that there's going to be further hostilities against the West for some time. And Hitler gathers his commanders together on the 27th September, and he says, we're going to attack France. We're going to do it now. I want you to sort all this out. And it was all they could do to talk him out of making that massive move in the autumn. As it is, we know it happens the following spring. But Dion Fortune, on the 1st of October, so this is literally just a couple of days later, she's a trance medium. Much of what she does is dictated, as far as she's concerned, by the inner plane masters. And she gets a very clear message. You must do something. And this is where this initiative to send these letters out, to democratize the whole process because of the fact that it's so urgent. She starts this whole thing off right there and then. Now, at that point, she's in London, and there are maybe about 100 people on this mailing list. And they're all around the country. They're being asked to focus on the London HQ. Now, it's only a couple of weeks in when one of the people reports back, I just kept on being dragged off to Glastonbury. You see, Dion Fortune had this home in Glastonbury as well. And she had a kind of a little mini bed and breakfast boarding house kind of thing going on. The Chalice Orchard Club, it was called. People would come up from London or come around from different parts of the country, and they'd stay in Glastonbury for long weekends, and they'd hang out with Dion Fortune there maybe and get into all the mythology and history. So a number of people on her mailing list knew Glastonbury. And one of them said, look, I just kept seeing Glastonbury tour all the time. And this was this is what they were looking for. This is why they were asking for the imagery to be fed back. So this begins a process whereby they all start focusing on Glastonbury tour. And Glastonbury tour is a huge hollow hill. And a lot of changes come to this imagery in terms of the whole Arthur and Merlin and Christ and how they hang together and what it looks like in terms of a Kabbalistic formulation. This goes on for months. And at the point where it's finally complete, they get to a point where the Virgin Mary is kind of seen holding a chalice, and the way it's all configured with her beneath this cross and Christ above it, it's like, okay, that's it, isn't it? That's it. Now, this is right at the end of April 1940, and it's within less than a fortnight that the Nazis attack the Low Countries and invade France. So the dynamic that's begun the previous September, where Hitler said, right, we're doing this thing, we are attacking France, and Dion Fortune starting this thing off, plays out a cycle, and that inner plane preparation is complete at the very point where France finally does get invaded. So that's just one example. Obviously, I've done a 500-odd page book here. This made me feel that I was on a winner. And beyond that, I felt that what was going on in 1940 with this Glastonbury imagery was the product of decades of development. There had been a whole bunch of people in Glastonbury in the first few decades of the last century who were generally called the Avalonians, after a book by a guy called Patrick Benham, who wrote about them. There's Frederick Bligh Bond, who did psychic archaeology in Glastonbury Abbey. There's Wellesley Tudor Pole, who went on to form the Chalice Well Gardens Charity Trust. There's Alice Butt, and I'll say a little bit more about her later. And the whole mythology of Joseph Arimathea coming to Glastonbury, the young Jesus perhaps coming with him, and how that relates to Blake's hymn Jerusalem and to those feet in ancient times, etc. All of this is a product of the interwar years, and the visualizations are an expression of that. And on the other hand, in Germany, what you've got going on at Wavelsburg, Himmler's Grail Castle, is a result of decades of development of ideas that are called Ariosophical. It's like Blavatsky's Theosophy with a distinctly racist Aryan overlay relating to German mythology and its exploitation. There are a bunch of figures that play into this. And I thought to myself, I'll get a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet together, and I'll have one column for Glastonbury and I'll have one column for Germany, and I'll read books about this stuff. I'll reread Patrick Benham's The Avalonians. I'll read The Occult Roots of Nazism by Nicholas Goodrick Clark, which was the first really credible academic work on the subject. And anything interesting, I'll just stick it on my spreadsheet. And when I've finished all this, I'll just read across the lines for all these different years. I had every year from 1875 to 1940. What's going on? Is there a bigger picture? And I satisfied myself that there was. You know, I also brought Rudolf Steiner into this quite extensively. You know, that was very, very interesting.
Well, Steiner was definitely a visionary. If you just think of like the biodynamic farming, how he saw the depletion of the soil years and years ahead of what was going on, and I always felt he was. I find him difficult to read personally, but I worked on in a Waldorf school as a grocery clerk, and I really loved the practical application of what he taught, and I thought he was just such a visionary in general, you know, Steiner.
Well, one of the things that I took from The Spirit of Destiny, that's a very unreliable book in many respects, was an interest in Steiner and a sense of him being a spiritual opponent of the Nazis. And it's fascinating that as early as 1921, none other than Adolf Hitler himself, in an early edition of the Nazi newspaper, the Völkische Beobachter, wrote an article denouncing Steiner, because Steiner had come up with a kind of social theory, the threefold social theory, about how society should be reorganized after the First World War. And he was an important figure. A lot of significant figures in Germany knew Steiner. And so the Nazis considered him to be an enemy. You know, I've got a reasonable amount of stuff in my Occult Battle of Britain about all of this. So I started writing this thing in 2010, and it went in fits and starts. I would have a whole year where I was on it, and then something else would take me over and I'd write another book. By 2016, the Queen had her 90th birthday, and there was going to be a beacon on the tour, but I'd also been asked if I would do a lecture on this old business. So I found myself Magical Battle of Britain, Past and Present Perspectives. It is one of the things that's on my YouTube playlist for Occult Battle of Britain. I actually gave a lecture on all of this, going from before the First World War right up to 1940 on that same night. And I paused in the middle of it so that synchronized with the point where this beacon was lit on Glastonbury tour, all of us in the room just very briefly went into 1940 visual mode. So I was getting used to this. And that was the same year that Donald Trump became president. And a lot of people started talking about hexing Trump. And 1940 and Dion Fortune began to be talked about. And was this potential inspiration? And I thought there was a lot of things about this that were wrong-headed. First of all, if you're going to mount some kind of magical attack on somebody, you don't tell them.
Yeah.
You don't publicize it across the entire planet, regardless of who, you know, Trump himself may have around him. There's no question that there's plenty of people out there who support him who will mount a robust defense of that. And also, the most important thing, if you read the letters in 1940, there were people who suggested to Dion Fortune, can we do something to directly attack Hitler? Can we take it? Shall we try and take him down? And she completely and utterly refused to engage it on that level of the game. Her sense was this is entirely defensive. If we build up the strength of our own spiritual force, our own archetypes, if you like, and national mythology, that in itself, that's what we're doing here. That will prevail. What has to happen on the physical plane is kind of like a different aspect of this that we may affect in some way. But no, she expressly forbade that. So I felt the roping in Dion Fortune in 1940 as part of the whole hexing Trump business didn't work for me. I didn't think it was appropriate. I thought it was a misunderstanding of the source material. And there's been lots of other things relating to Britain leaving the European Union, the so-called Brexit, where people have tried to get me interested in somehow taking sides in that and using this kind of raw material. And I've always turned away from it. So as we get to 2019, I finally complete Qabalah. I get it out there. It was a massive thing in itself, though. But I then, a couple of years later, we came into sight of the Platinum Jubilee of Queen Elizabeth. And what was interesting about it was a centenary as well of an event in Glastonbury in 1922 when a woman called Alice Buckton, who was known to Dion Fortune, who was in many respects almost her next door neighbour, and gets mentions in Avalon of the Heart, galvanised the whole town into producing a unique silent movie of Glastonbury's mythology and life. Then it's called Glastonbury Past and Present. And if you go onto the British Film Institute website, you can find it and see it, watch it for nothing. There's a combination of little playlets of historical episodes associated with Glastonbury. Joseph Arimathea coming here, a visit by Edward III, and then there's an enormous parade down the high street where there are all the people of the town at that time and people in historical costumes that have been in the different parts of it. And we realised that what we could do is we could weave the commemoration of the centenary of that into our celebrations of the Queen's Jubilee. We could make it very distinctly Glastonbury. And I was a friend of the mayor of the time, a guy called John Cousins, who's very into the history of Glastonbury Abbey. And he invited me onto a Jubilee committee that was going to oversee the kind of events that might occur in the course of the year as an ideas man. And I said to him, why don't, because this thing was supposed to last over the entire year. It was going to peak in June, the anniversary of the Queen's coronation, but it was spread out over the course of the entire year. I said, why don't we call it Avalon of the Heart? Why don't we have Avalon of the Heart as the umbrella term for the entire year's commemorations? And people agreed to that, and so it came to pass. I was also into the mystical artist Nicholas Roerich and his, art for peace idea, and the mystical symbol that he's got of these three red dots in a red circle being held by this Madonna. And I thought to myself, this Pax Cultura, what we've got in Glastonbury is art for peace. What we've got here, our mythology and history, is a world treasure. Let's bring that in. So a wonderful woman in Glastonbury called Talia Brown made these banners of Rurik Peace Pack symbols, of a Madonna holding a banner, and our Jubilee became the Pax Cultura Avalon of the Heart Royal Platinum Jubilee. And we ended up having a parade down the high street, and it was filmed and morphed together for an official film with the 1922 ceremonials. So that was all very interesting. And I was taking people into Glastonbury Abbey at that point and standing in the exact places where various abbots were interred and reciting their names and saying a little bit about them, and taking Avalon of the Heart into the Abbey and standing in situ and reciting some of the passages from Avalon of the Heart right in the middle of Glastonbury Abbey. If there was a woman in the group who was into Dion Fortune, I'd ask if she wanted to read this out aloud. So we would have, to stand in the centre of the great nave, looking towards the high altar is like standing waist deep in a swift mountain stream. Invisible force is rushing past with a streaming moment. So to recite that in situ, looking up towards the high altar, very, very potent stuff. And I just got into the habit of doing that kind of thing. And what's happened within the last, just over the last month, we've had the D-Day 8-year anniversary. And I sort of really just had found myself in a position where I'm so habituated to functioning in a certain way that I will just work my magic of a Dion Fortune nature almost effortlessly. We had a number of dignitaries. We had the High Sheriff of Somerset, the Lord Lieutenant of Somerset. These are representatives of the King, you know, and these people turn up in Glastonbury a lot because they love our history and tradition and what we're doing here. And it's yet another beacon lit on the tour. And these guys are just about to be involved in lighting this beacon. And I just sidle up to them and say, oh, you might be interested to know about what happened during 1940. There was a woman who had a home in Glastonbury called Dion Fortune, and she sent these letters out to people, and every single week they would all sit together and imagine the inside of Glastonbury tour as being hollow, and there'd been a big red rose and across the gold, and Jesus and Mary and Arthur and Merlin were there, and they were radiating the spiritual protective force against the evils of Nazism. So I just dropped this in with these guys a matter of minutes before they were involved in actually lighting another beacon on the tour. And it was, this is the kind of way that my magic works. It's a long time since I've done lesser banishing rituals of the pentagram. It's a long time since I've stuck on robes and waved swords about and shouted out the names of angels and all this kind of thing. I feel that what I'm doing here of that nature is magic, you know, that is absolutely powered up with the very essence of what Dion Fortune was all about and what she communicates as the Avalon of the heart. And the first page of that book, she says that the poetry of the soul writes itself at Glastonbury. And I consider our stories, our history, our mythology, you can't separate them a lot of the time, to be soul poetry. These stories of Joseph Arimathea coming here, they may not be historically true, but when you're here, when you're engaging with those stories, there is something numinous about them. They are portals to a higher emotional understanding that might otherwise not be available. And that is the purpose of these archetypes of the Western mystery tradition in the locations that give them, you know, their greatest powering up, of which Glastonbury is one. And I was also very conscious that, you know, as an aside, but it's a good story because we're coming up to 80 years of the end of the war in Europe next year. We had some American GIs stationed in Glastonbury. And, you know, undoubtedly they went on to D-Day and who knows what in Europe. And I'd become a little bit obsessed with finding out a bit more about them. And on that day, D-Day, I was kind of getting quite agitated. And then we had a moment with one of these dignitaries down in the town centre. We were going to have a minute's silence. There was a whole bunch of people gathered around. And I sidled up to him and said, oh, there are a bunch of American GIs stationed here, you know, just up the road. And nobody, you know, they haven't had a name check or anything. I think they deserve a name check because, you know, there would have been unquestionably at D-Day, whereas it was hard to establish how many people from Glastonbury itself were at D-Day. And so when this guy had something to say a matter of moments later, he gave him a name check. And one of the things I'm involved in is I think it must be possible to find out more about these people, to actually put some names and places and biographies to one or two of them, find out what happened to them from where they went in Glastonbury and to commemorate them next year, you know. And there was a bell ringing around all the churches in the country not long after that time. And it turned out that we weren't sure whether our bell ringers were going to be able to do it. So one of these committee meetings, I'm more or less kind of shamed if you shame them into doing it. We can't possibly have a nationwide bell ringing without the church in Glastonbury ringing its bells. And so that came to pass. And the event down in the town, I said, well, we've got to have some 1940s music, haven't we? Can we get some Glenn Miller type music? So they wheeled in, it wasn't quite the same, but they wheeled in our brass band and they did some 1940s music. So that's just how, you know, that's where I've got to now. And the fact that this conversation is even happening, I'm going to put out a yo to Mona, who I met through the controversy that we've had here concerning the moving of a Madonna and Child statue at the Chastel Gardens. I cannot go into this subject in any detail now because it's enormous and epic, but it switched everybody's heads on to an unprecedented extent. And I made some public posts on Facebook on it, and that's how Mona saw some of them and checked in with me and then checked in with you. And here we are.
Yes.
So it's a very interesting time conversation because of that. And the fact that I've only in the last couple of months got print on demand editions of My Occult Battle of Britain and Archetypes available from Amazon in the USA. So, you know, anybody over your side of the pond can connect up with that work. And on my website, paulwestonglastonbury.com, you will find under lectures, I've got, for example, some recorded Zoom lectures that you can buy. I've got one on Dion Fortune, Glastonbury 1940. That's an hour and a half long. There's 78 images in that. There's a lot going on that. And I've also got, you can get through to my YouTube channel where I've got a playlist of a number of interviews like this, lectures that have been filmed on all of these subjects. There's a couple of them. I think there's Dion Fortune and Carol Maria Villiger.
Yes, I saw that one.
Magicians. The sound quality and the visuals are not brilliant. I sometimes get a bit of grief for that, but most of these are all right. Obviously, there's a certain amount of repetition, but a lot of material out there for people that are potentially interested. And you mentioned that I'm a tour guide, Avalon of the Heart Tours. I've got a Facebook page for Avalon of the Heart Tours. And, you know, the photo that you've put of me is my Facebook profile photo. I'm very easy to find and communicate with. Yeah, I do have some meaningful connections and interactions with people from the USA who come here and, you know, I take around on tours and so forth. It'd be wonderful to meet a few more. So I'll shut up now, and that gives you a few moments to feed some stuff back to me.
Well, I wanted to say something about the power of what Dion Fortune did with the visualizations. I loved that book. I read the book that Gareth Knight edited. That was the first time. And I, because I don't belong to an order, Western esoteric order, to see the complexity of the visualizations and how she opened it up to even people that were not part of her group. I think I hadn't realized the amount of effort was put into to create these visualizations during the war. And it sounds like what they did, it's still there in that you can sort of revitalize it.
A lot of people have, you know, certainly when I've led groups doing my version of it, is that it's something that it's already there. You're just seeing it. You're not kind of conjuring it up and trying to visualize it. You're just getting into a space where you are seeing something that is already there and has already got a current connecting all the different bits. And the great thing about doing these visualizations, especially if you've got a group of people, is that different people will be drawn to different bits of it. You know, somebody will want to plug into the Virgin Mary or Christ or Arthur or Merlin, where there's a whole bunch of stuff potentially going on for them. And the internal landscape of Glastonbury Tour became increasingly worked out over the course of the months. That there was, as well as this chamber where this basic action was, you know, there was a stairway, there was a chamber with a library just above, and you could go into this library and potentially sort of pick a book off and open it up and somehow get a download of whatever information you needed. And you could go outside to the equivalent of where the ruined church tower now stands. And you would encounter this fearsome being this cow watcher. And that, when I say watcher, that's got nothing to do with the Watchers of the Book of Enoch or anything like that. This is a figure who has got this immense perspective of the unfolding of the cycles of history and so on, the big, big picture. You could potentially go and check in with that figure and see things for yourself, but there was the warning that that's a bit of an intense one to plug into. But you've got a group of people, they're going to be going all over the place. And when you come back and get the feedback from the whole lot of them, and you attempt to see unity in it, it can become quite astonishing.
Absolutely. Now, how do you think, because we're talking about a specific area of the world, what do you think her teachings are in terms of relevance for anyone in any country, just as someone that maybe has only introductory knowledge to magic?
Well, I certainly think it's a case of connecting up, on the one hand, the indigenous mythology, the multiple levels of that. Now, Dion Fortune believed in the reality of Atlantis. She believed that Arthur and Merlin and Morgan were not just one individual, but were a title, and that there have been multiple people bearing that title that went all the way back to Atlantis, that there had been kind of strange crossbreeding between the Atlantean high adepts and the Celts. This is all a bit weird. But wherever you are, you've got layers of history. You've got potential, even if Christianity has imposed itself with the sword, somewhere along the line, you're going to find some saint who seems more like a druid, or something like that. And there are ways of assuming that there is a potential equilibration, invite it to present itself through whatever consideration of the history and mythology of wherever you happen to live. And as it does so, then, well, okay, what's this all about? And it may not be that you get some very distinct answer relating to what's going on, but it will be such a satisfying, fulfilling experience to feel yourself connected up, because I'm in a very rich historical environment. So with the Glastonbury mythology, I'm potentially going back through the incredible history of the Abbey, which is a real history, and into some mythic hinterland that extends who knows far back, and that you potentially have connections to all of it through the Dion Fortune work. Now, not everywhere has got something as rich as Glastonbury, but anywhere has got layers and layers and layers. And if you assume that, however much brutality has gone down, there is potentially equilibration, there is potentially harmony. See whether you can be an agent of that, which I think is quite powerful magic.
I love that. And it seems to me Dion Fortune was also really, as you said, because of the pagan connection, really did connect people into that, the elements, and also you could probably extend it into whatever animals are around you. Perhaps that can be some form of recognition that you're tapping in through synchronicities. There's certain animals native to your area that they may indicate when you're doing your own connection, and you don't have a lot of, maybe like Glastonbury, a lot of mythology, but perhaps nature itself can be some of the mythology of your particular area.
Well, outside of the obvious realms of the Qabalah, part of if you get the Dion Fortune's work, there's talk of different rays, and there's a green ray, which is a nature ray, where you're going to find a whole bunch of energies and mythology that are of the natural world and of the ancient ways, the kind of thing that finds its modern expression with certain forms of paganism. There's certainly something very satisfyingly rooted about it.
Well, we are getting to the end of the show. I want to thank you for coming on, and everyone check out his books. They're available on Amazon, and his website is going to be listed on our website so you can easily find him. And we thank you again for coming on, Paul.
Yeah, my pleasure. And I'm easy enough to find on Facebook if anyone wants to connect up with me.
Paul Weston. And thank you, Mona. You're such a great support of the show. Join us all next time as we continue to explore the esoteric and the obscure together. Have a magical week.